Hi, good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are. My name is Saijai, and I would be your host today. So if you would like to listen in Burmese, we have Burmese translation available on Zoom. And at the end of the session, we would have 15 minutes Q&A. So if you have any questions, you could also ask at the end by putting your question on the Q&A section. Our conversation today is on digital trauma from the war to Ukraine and conflict in Myanmar and what we see in the news. We live in the world that's full of graphic images. So how could we work safely with harmful online content? Today, I have two wonderful speakers that I really admire, and I'm really excited that they're taking time to share with us today. Alexa and Andrea. So Alexa and Andrea, they both co-founded Human Rights Center Investigation Lab at UC Berkeley. Andrea is a communication director at UC Berkeley School of Education. Alexa is executive director at Human Rights Center. She also directs the development of Berkeley protocol on open source investigation and have trained open source investigation technique to many organizations around the world. So I'm really excited that you both are joining us today. To any further ado, we're going to start the conversation. I would like to start with you, Andrea. If you could share a little bit more about what inspired you to work on this topic? How you become interested in digital trauma?
Well, first, thank you so much for having us with you today, and thank you so much for the important work that you do at Witness. We are big fans of your work, and we know the importance of it. I will say, so this work and the work on resiliency and thinking about digital trauma, really for me, it starts before digital in my work in human rights. I started to work with human rights in many years ago with work related to Central America and US policy, specifically in El Salvador, and was exposed to the extreme human rights violations generated there by the US support for a very bad government in El Salvador and throughout Central America. So that was my first exposure to human rights work. I continued to do human rights related work with refugees and immigrants in the United States. And all of that was before becoming a journalist in the United States, and then also in my work at the Human Rights Center. But I'll let Alexa talk a little bit about her work before the Human Rights Center, and then we can say some words about the Human Rights Center Investigations Lab, which I think is really right at the heart of why we worked on this book, but also all of our work related to digital trauma and the work for resiliency.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you so much. Just to echo Andrea's words of how grateful we are to have this opportunity to speak with you and to honor the work of Myanmar Witness. My background is as a lawyer and as a social scientist. I think one of the first memories that I have of the power of visual imagery was in a big project that I did at the Human Rights Center when I was a PhD student, looking at the experiences of men who'd been detained at Guantanamo Bay and the torture they'd experienced. We had a team, first through the University of San Francisco and later through the Berkeley Human Rights Center. The University of San Francisco team would videotape men as they were released from Guantanamo about their experiences. And the idea was that this would become a powerful tool that journalists and lawyers and human rights activists could use to help get these stories out to the world and hopefully put on pressure to change the on-the-ground situation of these men in detention. And, while I was very deeply dedicated to the role of video to make change, I think I also, as an academic, began looking at the challenges that come with visual imagery. Things like when you have a video of an atrocity, the perspective that it gives you on what's happening can be distorting of what is happening on the ground, depending on when it's used for propaganda, etc. But it can also be very revealing and very emotionally engaging for good and for bad. And so I think a lot of the work that Andrea and I have been doing at the Human Rights Center and at the investigations lab has really been focused on the how do we harness these videos and other visual imagery for the good and eliminate some of the negative consequences of working with really traumatic and graphic content.
So in 2016, we founded the Human Rights Center Investigations Lab. We co-founded, and this was a lab to use open source investigation techniques, analysis of videos and photos, the work that I know you do, to investigate human rights violations and to teach students how to do that. And so this work we started with Sam Dubberly at Amnesty International, and in the very beginning from that work, we realized that we were going to be having students look at very traumatic visual imagery. Mainly, I remember some of the very first days when we were training students, we were looking at video after video from Syria. It was very, very difficult. But from the outset, we realized with Sam's guidance, but also with one of our board members, Elizabeth Farnsworth at the Human Rights Center, they said to us, you cannot train students to do this very difficult work, young people to do this work and throw them into this very hard content, emotionally challenging content without preparing them, without thinking about what it is, what are the tools that you can use and the strategies to keep yourself safer and to not only come into that process with open eyes and techniques and skills, but to continue in that work for the long haul. And so this was really a living laboratory for us to learn not only from those who had done this before, but from our students who were grappling with this every day. And they taught us a lot about what was hard and what was challenging and how they could make it through and to continue to do the work. And I'll let you say more, Alexa.
Maybe I'll just add that I think from the beginning, we saw how much meaning this kind of work can bring into people's lives when they personally have suffered some of the atrocities they're now investigating or their family members have. For them to have the ability to engage with this material and do something hopefully positive with it can be incredibly empowering. But it can also, when we identify with the material, and I know we'll talk more about that in a little bit, be something that we can identify with to such an extreme that it can actually re-traumatize us and trigger a lot of emotions that we maybe don't anticipate. And so I think our commitment was, if we are going to help train a generation of people to do human rights work, we really have a responsibility to be resilient ourselves, to model what we're preaching. And I think that's been an ongoing practice. I can certainly say for myself, I'm not perfect at it. It's an ongoing lesson or series of lessons. And to give students as many of the tools as already exist and people know about to protect themselves and their teammates and the people they care about, but to also recognize, and I was surprised about this at the beginning, that there's not more research and there wasn't more training that was part of the human rights canon that we were all talking about. So I think with Andrea and I being responsible for all these relatively young people who were so passionate, but relatively new to the field, there really was a responsibility to get up to speed quickly on what are best practices, and to also think about what is not yet known that maybe we can help and partner with the students themselves to discover about what works and what doesn't.
Thank you so much, Alexa and Andrea, for sharing this. I also would like to mention to our audience that you both are releasing the book really soon on graphic. So you're doing research on this book and on digital trauma, and this book will be releasing very soon. So from what you see from your own research and your work, this is a marathon, right? It's not a short period when people are signed up to this work. They're not only doing it for a short time, they're doing it for a longer time. So how do we ensure that our colleagues or friends could do this for long haul and be safe?
It's such an important question, and that's exactly why we wrote the book, and why we are working on this, because one of what's so key that I think we both feel is that we need to change the entire approach to how we do human rights work in this digital time. And even before, I mean, as we were both saying, the human rights work we did before, the response to the trauma we encountered was often, drinking or doing, engaging in behaviors that aren't healthy, to mitigate some of the pain that you feel. And so we really feel like it's important to shift this macho kind of culture of push through it that we see in human rights work, in law, in journalism, and to really talk about how do we have side by side the work for human rights and justice in the world, while also modeling that ourselves, walking the walk and taking care of ourselves to do that, because that in some ways is the only way we can do it for the long haul. And so from that perspective, one of the things that I would like to mention is that we really hope that people will start by internalizing, especially people who are working like at Myanmar Witness, to think about the fact that you are, just because you are experiencing this trauma secondarily, perhaps through video content, you still can feel harm and you still can feel pain. And you also need to take care of yourself. And that can be and we have lots of different strategies and ways to think about that on an individual level, on a more collective level, on a structural level. So there's different ways. It's not all on you. It's on the organization, and it's on our broader culture to start thinking about these strategies. So I guess that's the framework that I would start with, is just that it has to be baked in. It cannot be a secondary thought for an individual or an organization to take care of yourself when you are engaging in work that is as difficult as this can be.
Maybe I'll add some of the statistics to what Andrea was talking about. There's a research that was done in human rights that lays out that 89.3% of people who do human rights work are exposed to trauma. I would imagine that in contexts like Myanmar that are hit by so much atrocity, the numbers may be even higher. That 40% experiencing with user-generated content, so those who are investigating using social media and other online resources, have been found to have vicarious trauma or be approaching vicarious trauma. The statistics also aren't great, as Andrea mentioned, about the ways we have historically tried to cope. A really common approach is, of course, drinking, as she mentioned. For lawyers who are working on issues of human rights, 1 in 5 lawyers has been found to be a problem drinker here in the United States. That's twice the national rate. And more than a third appear to struggle with alcohol abuse. As many as 45% of lawyers have been found to experience depression during their career. The numbers are very similar for journalists, particularly those who work on issues of war and atrocity. So I think, thinking about how do we shift this from relying on alcohol and other potentially harmful behaviors to more pro-social behaviors that may actually help us be stronger for having done this work and more in connection with those with whom we're working, I think became a really important challenge for us, as it has been for so many people in the space. So I think, one thing that we really learned in doing research for our book and for the investigations lab was, first of all, that importance of awareness of the traps that we can fall into. For each of us individually, what are our default patterns that may not be as healthy when we're struggling? But what are the things that actually make us feel good? Like for me, I know yoga or going for a hike or playing with my children, maybe things that leave me with sometimes a better sense of strength and escape, even if temporary, than other phenomena. And then also knowing what particularly affects us. And I think this is the really great part of working as a team. Is if, for example, Andrea is particularly affected by a certain kind of violence because she has a sensitivity to it or has experienced it herself, maybe I can take on more of that work, and the issues that get to me the most, if they're not the same, maybe she can take on some of that. So that awareness, and I think it also comes down to, I'll just make one more point of, researchers have really found that the element of surprise is a big piece of what can harm us when we're dealing with traumatic material. So thinking strategically about how do you minimize the aspect of surprise, so that if, for example, I'm sharing a video or a photograph with Andrea, I'm warning her beforehand, this has really upsetting material, really graphic material, and it involves X. For example, maybe it involves gunshots or someone being killed. Giving her a heads up so that she's not surprised can be very protective. Or if she's looking at a video or I'm looking at a video, scrolling through the thumbnails to give my brain a chance to prepare for what I'm about to witness, if I've decided it's important to see this video, I think can also help to minimize some of the harm of surprise.
And just one more thing to add to both of those aspects that Alexa just mentioned around awareness, but also around how we're working in teams. And I think this is important because we not only need to know and be aware of what is especially difficult for us as individuals, but what is difficult for our teammate, somebody working on a project collectively, and so that we can communicate about it and go through it together. Because I know that sometimes the work is so pressing that we want to move fast and we want to put our heads down, and we think we can't even take a break to look up, to talk, or to process, or to communicate with each other. But that part is really important to being able to take care not only of ourselves, but of each other. So I just wanted to mention that in the context of awareness about yourself, but awareness of your team as a collective is also important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexa and Andrea, for sharing this statistic. I'm still shocked by the statistic about how the high number of people still turn to alcoholism and such. My question is focused on the impact. From your research and from working in this space, how did this impact family? How did this impact the family of the investigators? How do we bring the trauma from work back to home? And yeah, if you can share a little bit more on that would be helpful, because I feel like it's not just impacted us, right? We also have impact on other people around us.
Absolutely. Alexa, do you want to start? Go ahead.
Sure. That's such an important question. And as someone who has 2 children and a husband, I've really struggled with that. It took me probably close to a decade to realize the impact of my work on them. I think it really started as a frustration of going to see how important this is, why I'm working nights and weekends. And for me, failing to really recognize that, of course, all my kids see is that they want their mother around and they want her to be fully present when she's with them. And I would often be distracted thinking about other stuff that we were working on or issues in the center. So I think a big piece of it has been recognizing that I have a responsibility to them as well. Through my children, there's a responsibility to the future and making sure that I'm able to be present for them so that they're the kinds of public citizens who feel that they want to engage with the difficult things of this world and make those difficult things better, that they don't just resent the work that I've tried to put in. But they also can set some boundaries that will hopefully make them even better at what they do over the long run. I think that's one of the analogies that helped me the most, was the analogy that some people have used, that whenever you're doing critical human rights work or are a first responder of some kind, how important it is to put on your oxygen mask before you help the person next to you. Because if you pass out or you burn out, you're not going to be able to help as many people in the long run. And so I think I've come through the work that Andrea and I've been doing and the research for this book to realize I've got to start integrating, limits in my own space and recognize that it's okay to put those limits in place. Something Andrea mentioned that I think is so important to underscore is we've had so many students who felt so guilty if they went for a walk or enjoyed the sunshine or went out for a meal or with friends when they were investigating such horrific things happening to other people. And yet what we're trying to, I think, flip the narrative around is you need those breaks to take that deep breath, to put that oxygen mask on so that you can help more people ultimately in the long run than you would otherwise. The last thing I might say is, I think my children in the beginning resented the work or were confused by it, but were proud of me for doing it. I think that has changed over time, where they are always now going to have a sensitivity to human rights issues. And I hope they're now seeing how to bring a little bit better balance to it.
I agree with all of that. I would add just one experience that we had with our students. I remember we were talking about resiliency and how do you talk about this with your family, with your with your loved ones, or with your housemates. In this setting, we were talking with students, so they were going home to group houses or their dorm room and talking to people. And I remember one student, Maria, she was talking about how frustrated she was because nobody understood. They couldn't, people who weren't doing the work just didn't get it. And she had a lot of kind of anger and frustration about that. And she would try to talk with them and realize that it actually was more important for her to talk with her peers and colleagues in the lab who were doing the work, because they kind of got it. So that's one thing I think to keep in mind, is that it's sometimes not going to be possible for people to understand how difficult the work you're doing can be. The other thing I would say is that with family, and I have 3 kids too, and as I was doing some of the work, especially I remember doing some review of videos related to Myanmar and how difficult it was to watch, and then stopping that work and then going to pick up my son from soccer practice, and the juxtaposition of the realities that people are living and my very safe, privileged life was a lot. And I think Alexa alluded to that kind of guilt as well. And it just is, that part's hard, and you have to think about how to grapple with that and know that it's still important, the work you're doing, and it is okay that you are living a different life. So those are some of the things that I think about when I think about my family. And I would really agree with what Alexa said about I think my kids also appreciate what they've learned from my work and in thinking about it too. And I think have changed, in fact, their orientation for some of the things they're doing in their work for the future because of it.
Thank you for sharing that, Alexa and Andrea. In your book, you talk a lot about identities. And so if you can share a little bit more about how identities could impact on how we respond to digital information. And the other question that I always curious is about, is it more harmful to look at the harmful content from your own culture or from someone else's culture? And I think like the information into this would also help the team to minimize surprise, right? Like if I know that, okay, this is the harmful content from my hometown, is it better if somebody else look at it, or is it better for me? I'm not sure what did your research find, and also how identity impacted this work.
There's so much to say on this one. Maybe I'll dive in with a first thought on, I think doing the research for this book, we definitely found that the biological response to traumatic material is very similar from human being to human being. We, when we're affected and we process something as traumatic, we enter into that fear, flight, fight kinds of responses that are very instinctual and very ancient in our biological makeup. But what we're going to actually experience as traumatic, there are also differences that really vary based on our identities and our experiences. One story from early in the lab that I think was such a learning process for me is we had an individual who was from Syria, and he of course kind of naturally gravitated towards the Syria work and the Syria project, and we thought to put him on it. He spoke the language, he understood a lot of the culture, and he came to us like a month or two in, and he just said, I need to change projects. this is way too politically sensitive in my family, and I am overwhelmed by it. And he was having a lot of the negative reactions that we'd all begun to be collectively aware can indicate that something's really getting under your skin. On the flip side, we had a young woman whose family was from Iran, and she worked on a project related to Iran. And she came to us and said, my whole life, I've heard about what my family suffered. And this is the first time I've been able to do anything about it. And it's the most meaningful work I've ever done. So you have these two young adults, both in their early 20s, late teens, who are working on their home countries or their families' countries of origin. One really found that it was not the right fit for him. He couldn't maintain the objectivity and he was suffering from the work. And another who felt empowered and engaged. I think one thing that we found is it's not just identity, though, it's also what's going on in your life at the moment. So for example, if you're already feeling stressed out for some reason, or you've recently gone through a trauma crisis yourself, you may be in a position where working on the material is not as easy to process through your body as it might be if you are in a better place already psychologically or physically. So knowing how our lives change from moment to moment. One classic example would be identity-wise, if you've just become a parent for the first time, you may find that violence against children suddenly affects you in a way that it never did before you had a child of your own. So it's also that awareness of how things can change over time and with your own experience that I think is super important. We have definitely seen a correlation that working on the material you identify with, and I know Andrea has a lot of stories about this from time in the lab, but that is the stuff that gets under your skin the most, even when it's not necessarily the most graphic material. The last thing I might mention is just the language part of it. I think oftentimes when you have diverse investigations or research teams, there's a tendency to put the people with the language skills and the cultural knowledge on an investigation related to that country, but they can become easily, I don't want to say overwhelmed, but they can become inundated with violence that they identify with. I think it's particularly acute risk in those situations. So if you have the ability to work on different issues or different contexts, that can be incredibly helpful.
The only thing I would add is that one thing that research has told us, and that we found with going deeper into this and talking to neuroscientists and therapists and others, is that the previous trauma can also make you more vulnerable to experiencing the trauma of others. And so, and that's not to say that you shouldn't do difficult human rights work that it has traumatic content. It's just, it goes back to also to awareness and to knowing how that trauma, whether that's related to your identity or not, might be, play a role or have be a factor in how you respond to certain kinds of content. And there's also places where, the biology and identity come together. So we learned of something called consolidation, kind of memory and of processing in your brain, where memories can become more sticky, and something will kind of, as Alexa said, get under your skin or connect to something in your brain. And so if you've had a traumatic experience related to your place of origin, or of whether that's being a parent, whether that's being a refugee yourself, in the United States, we also found that when we did a lot of work related to the George Floyd murder and some of that trauma that happened here, so many students felt so compelled to do it, but they also felt, it also really affected them, the work, and they had to take specific, additional care. So to your question of should you or should you not investigate, and I think the answer is that it depends on your response, and that's why it's so important to know and to be aware of yourself, because sometimes you're going to be a better investigator, as we found with students in the United States, you know, post the January 6th and through the Trump election, we found, and a lot of the police brutality, we found that students from the United States who were doing the investigations were better at it, and not better at it, but they knew more nuances of location and things to verify for videos, etc. But they also were more affected. So it can be both things.
Andrea, there's a very powerful story that relates to identity in the book Graphic that you wrote about. So I feel like it's more your story to tell, but I think it might be really interesting to hear a little bit more about the team that was working on hate speech against refugees. And many of the students were refugees or came from refugee families, and you had strategies that you used with them to help them with the emotional upset they were feeling. I didn't know if you might want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure, it's a good example, because in that example, the students were doing a project where they were looking at social media and they were looking at hate speech used against immigrants, undocumented people coming across the border, mainly from Mexico and other parts of Central America to the United States. And a lot of the language being used was violent language, terrible language, racist, brutal, anti-immigrant, xenophobic language. But it wasn't necessarily graphic. They weren't necessarily looking at people being killed or being harmed physically, but they were reading these things. And so we didn't, I think in the beginning, anticipate how difficult this project would be for students. But after time, after day in, day out, them culling these tweets and other types of social media that referred to immigrants as insects or as rats or things like this that were so horrible, it's really started affecting them. So one thing that we did is we brought everyone together for an evening. I mean, we did this a lot where we would try to have people talk through what they were feeling and experiencing. But in this instance, we brought people together and people went around the room and talked about what was so difficult, but they also talked about what they knew to be true about the immigrants in their lives. We had one of our, she was an instructor and a student, but Gisela, who she taught students a song that her grandmother used to sing her. She's Mexican, and she taught the song in Spanish. But others talked about what they knew to be true, and so we put that all down actually on pieces of paper with the words, the positive words like, you know, father and uncle and strong and perseverance and courageous and all the things that you know to be true about immigrants crossing the border. And it was very cathartic and an experience communally where we were able to share the positivity to try to push away some of the negative. Of course, people were still affected by the work, but it was just a really great exercise, community exercise in kind of trying to get rid of that negative space.
I remember there are students who interested in open source investigation asking me a question after they watched. We have a seminar before on mental health and open source investigation. And the question from the student was, hey, if I'm working in this space in human rights and open source investigation and disinformation, am I destined to be depressed? You know, like from everything we have talked about, it seemed like, am I gonna be like depressed, alcoholic, and I'm gonna be sad in my life? So, however, when I was reading your book, you mentioned something about positive psychology and post-traumatic growth. So could you share a bit more on that, so people who are interested in this space or people who are working in this space don't feel like it's all gray and gloomy? And yeah.
I think this is something Andrea and I really want to continue to work on exploring, because it's such a promising area of research for human rights practitioners. So there's a whole branch of psychology called positive psychology, whereas more traditional psychology focuses on the pathologies. So kind of the ways things can go wrong psychologically. Positive psychology is really the study of what can go right. one example is a researcher named Metin Seligman. And one of the things that he's done is taken a look at the United States Army and tried to figure out, when you have all of these people exposed to maybe very traumatic incidents, how do you increase the number of people who actually become stronger and more resilient as a result of their experiences than permanently harmed? And he and others have shown that there's really a bell curve to people's responses to graphic material and to trauma. The majority of the people in the middle are going to feel negative ramifications for, on average, somewhere between 2 and 4 months. They may not sleep as well. They may have nightmares. They may not eat well or drink well. But the majority will return to a baseline of functioning once the trauma has passed and they're able to kind of reintegrate into their lives. There is a smaller percentage on one tail end who may be permanently negatively affected by their experience or experiences. But there's another tail end that's about the same size of people who will be positively, in the long run, impacted. And by positively, I mean feel more resilient, more in charge of their life, more ready to engage with these issues in ways that may bring positive energy and positive outlooks on humanity. And so his study and the study of many other psychologists has been on how do we maximize the size of that group? And there's a lot of tips and tricks in the positive psychology literature that are coming out about things you can do to hopefully shift yourself towards that end of the spectrum, without, of course, wanting to put too much pressure on people to always feel good. I think that's unrealistic. It's very normal human empathy to feel sad when you see something horrible happen to another human being. That actually means we're not dissociated and we still have the capacity to feel. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, is not all bad feelings are necessarily bad for the long run, but actually may connect us to being human. But hopefully we can become stronger on the other side.
And I think that's something that we thought a lot about when we thought about the difference between on the ground human rights work and digital human rights work, because often when you're there physically, you also have the experience, the more full experience of humanity, of the joy, and also being proximate to courageous people who are struggling for something better in the world and who are putting their lives on the line for justice and human rights. And so often that's more possible to kind of feel that and to have the joy and satisfaction and inspiration of being near people when you're in person. But I do think it is still possible to have that in the digital realm, because and that's why it's really important. And one of the things that we were doing in the lab, which it does get to the positive psychology, which I don't think we knew it at the time, but was to try to encourage a fuller picture, like if students were investigating Syria, to also think about, okay, what are some of this, let's talk about Syrian art and poetry. Let's look at the places that existed before the atrocities that happened. Let's bring Syrian people in, survivors and activists and people to talk about their experience and to inspire. And so that was actually really important. And I think that's one way to kind of combat this digital divide and that takes us from humanity, because really, like, if we were to step back, and even though the work on a day-to-day basis can be so grueling and depressing, it's really a gift to be able to do work that is for something more, that has meaning, and that gives us, that gives us life to do that with people and in solidarity with people in different parts of the world. So that I would say, but then also one thing, just to carry on what Alexa was saying about positive psychology, and Metin Seligman, who is the kind of founder of this thinking around positive psychology, talks a lot about relationships. And that is also, I think, something super important that we learned before doing research for the book, but also in this, it backed it up about how important your team is in the work and the joy that you can generate from that, because that's all about relationships and relationships to each other. And because if you think about it, and what he talks about is, what are some of the most positive experiences of your life? They're usually the joy and the laughter from being in a group of people related to something positive, something, the interactions you have with others, and the kind of profound meaning that comes from that, whether it's a birth or a birthday or a celebration of some kind, and the laughter you can find. So if you can generate that on your team as well, that is something that can be really important to resiliency.
I think one thing I would add to that too is that the good news is there's a lot we can do to try to minimize harm and maximize the positive. There's another researcher, Myanmar in Turkey, who's done a lot of work with earthquake survivors and war survivors, and really tried to come up with theories about how do you empower people to, how do you hopefully help a lot of people recover quickly, when you're sometimes talking about thousands, if not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who've been harmed. And one of the theories he's developed is this idea that anxiety comes from having a sense of a lack of control, and depression comes from having a sense of a lack of hope. So I think one kind of guiding principle for all of us becomes, how do we maximize our sense of control over what we're dealing with on a daily basis? And how do we maximize our sense of hope in order to combat depression? And it can be things as little as you can have control over, if you're doing online research, for example, of what people are going through, controlling when and where you do the research, sitting by a window, having a ritual by which you start the research and end it to signal to your body you're moving on to something else. All of these little things can ultimately help you gain control and hopefully lessen some of the anxiety that's very natural to feel in this work. On the hope side, I think there's really an encouragement to celebrate even the small wins. Many of us are often doing this because we have this long range goal. We're playing a long game. We want to see the perpetrators behind bars or the international community condemn the violence our families or the people we are in service of have experienced. But how do we celebrate the little things? Like, we found that video that we think could be helpful, or we managed to get a report out that is being picked up on by a couple of news outlets that may actually get the attention of other people. It's starting to break it down into the little steps and celebrating each step we take, instead of saying we're only successful when we've got this one person behind bars, because we may never get that person behind bars. And really, it's about shifting the world in ways that the harm is acknowledged for the people who've suffered, and that we hopefully prevent that further harm and honor the suffering that so many people have gone through.
That part is so important, that even just bearing witness of documenting and knowing the meaning in that is of value. And I think I think that can't be underscored enough, is that those small steps, and that really onus of that can be really on the organization, because sometimes we put this on individuals and say, oh, well, if you just take care of yourself more, if you do yoga, if you meditate, or if you take a run, you'll be fine. But it's really on the structure. I mean, and that those are important strategies, and we have to think about things on an individual level. But organizationally, how do we help each other think about how to have more control? And that may an agency, and that may be giving people the chance to take a break when they need a break. That's one thing we did in the lab. Now, of course, it's a little bit different. It's a student organization, different, I know, than a professional human rights organization. But it was really important for students to know that they could step out at any time, change projects at any time, that they had some level of control over what they were doing. We talked to some content moderators for our book, and that was something that they brought up time and again, is and also we've, you know, read a lot and seen videos about this, but just taking the fact that you don't have any control over what you're seeing, and you also don't have any control over knowing that it made a difference. That research tells us that part of it, not knowing that you're looking at terrible things for what reason, that there's got to be some reason. And so just to circle back, I think it's really important that the organization underscores that for individuals in the organization. What you're doing has meaning. The small steps have meaning, as Alexa said, the small goals and accomplishments, not just the big victories that sometimes are very elusive. So that's important, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrea and Alexa. I think I have so many questions, but I will ask my last question, and then we will move to the audience to submit question on the Q&A. There are some questions coming in. So if you have any question, feel free to use Q&A to submit in either any other languages. You could submit in Burmese, in English. I think in any language that we can help translate the questions. I write down four things from, I like how you talk about how individual could take care of themselves, and also how organization could also do the work. And also maybe we want to talk a bit about the role of the platform. I think this is one of the questions, right? So how individual, organization, and platform could do this. And from the individual level, I write 4 notes, and I would love you to add more if you have any ideas. So the first one that you mentioned is about self-awareness, right? Having self-awareness of what's happening. The second one, which I really like and I haven't think about, is not when you work on the topic, you could also celebrate the culture of that issues, you know, instead of just looking into the images, horrible images. And let's say if you work on Myanmar, you could talk more about Burmese food, Burmese art, and Burmese music. And I really like that idea, not just working on like all the images, horrible images from the country. And the third one that you mentioned is about community and laughter. Right? How could we build a community and come together and work on this and have more laughters on the issues, you know, like not on the issue, but laugh together more and celebrate birthdays and such. The fourth one is also the sense of control and hope. To maximize the sense of control and hope, this could apply into when and where we do the work. We can control that. And also in terms of hope, maybe celebrate small win instead of waiting for the big win. These are the 4 things that I add for the individuals could take away. Is there anything else you would add on the individual side?
I mean, I think something that we've touched on is certainly like to think about one of the things that is talked about a lot in digital investigations is almost thinking about some of this graphic, particularly visual material, as toxic waste. So thinking about how do you minimize your exposure? How do you minimize the exposure of other members of your team? And I think this relates to something Andrea just talked about knowing why you're looking at something. When I was early on in this work, if someone sent me a really horrible video and was like, you have to see this, I would have opened my laptop, even if it was like 11 o'clock at night, my children were in bed, I was about to go to bed, and I would have watched it. Now I'll go, do I really need to watch that horrible video? If I do I really want to watch it right before I go to bed and have it playing in my head all night and having it imprinting in my memories and not be able to get it out? Or do I want to do it in daylight the next morning when I sit at my desk and I open my laptop? So it's these little choices that I think add to our control, but also are understanding our own biology and the ways memories are imprinted to minimize the risk of just getting stuck seeing those videos in our head over and over again and not being able to let them go. So the tips and tricks that I think are best practices, you know, things like changing things to grayscale if you're working with a video or a photograph to lessen the emotional impact, make things seem less real. Also turning down the sound or turning off the sound if you don't need it, because so much emotional content is in what we hear. We don't necessarily need that when we're analyzing a video or a photograph. And even some people have found that changing the ways the video runs from the words, like just slightly making them off sync, or if you're watching a video, say on YouTube, changing the time to like 1.5 or 2, so it's extra slow or extra fast, can break that sense of this is happening now in real life and give you some emotional distance to be able to be even better, hopefully, at the analytical process, but relieve some of the emotional strain of doing the work.
Andrea,
The
go
only thing
ahead.
I'd add on the personal side, and it just sort of gets embedded, I think, in just different tips and tricks, but is this idea of some kind of mindfulness practice. Now, this has been, we know from research that this has been important for all kinds of people engaged in traumatic work, whether they're in the military or police or social workers or others. And I wanted to just put this out there that some kind of practice doesn't mean I think we often think this has to be a quiet, I'm sitting and meditating and quiet. And it doesn't. There's all kinds of mindfulness practice, from just walking in the woods and just trying to be present, to even listening to music really loudly and being in the moment, to just some kind of practice that you can be there without this rumination. And so that, I would say, is something that I try to do, and I think is really great to integrate into any kind of practice of resiliency that you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea and Alexa. We have at least 6 questions coming in and some more on my inbox. So just to let you know that we have a lot of questions from the audience. We will start with the first question, is about what role can do what role of the digital platform, which is like Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, can play in mitigating this trauma?
So
I'll remind you, we have like 7 more questions.
Yes, I will answer this part very quickly. We've been talking with the major platforms since 2014 on issues of atrocity. And I think one of the things they can do is give more control to the viewer. So the more that they can either warn people what they're about to see, or even let the viewer have more control over whether videos play on auto feed. I know that's often an option to turn off autoplay. The more control the platforms can give the viewer, the less the potential for harm to that individual. So I know that some of them are experimenting. Content moderation is, of course, a big piece of this as well, making sure that a lot of the most harmful content is potentially not going to be something the everyday viewer at least is exposed to. One of the things we've been fighting for is for some of that information that may be relevant to Myanmar or other incidents where there are legal cases being built or will be built, is to put it into some kind of international evidence locker. So even if human beings aren't exposed to it initially, it's there if needed later for justice purposes.
Thank you, Alexa. The other question we have, you can also see it on the Q&A, which is, does outcomes have any impact on how investigators and others process trauma? Given that justice outcomes are so rarely achieved in case of human rights investigation, especially internationally, does this impact how people experience and process the trauma and the work? For example, given the ICJ case from Burma and the ICC investigation are unlikely the prospect of justice in this case, or it take a long time.
Do you want to respond to that, Alexa?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that we've seen is that we're often all holding our breath for the big legal outcome. And either that outcome doesn't come, or even when it does, it often will give us a high in the moment, but then feel unsatisfying longer term, in part because you never can truly get justice for the scale of harm that's been perpetrated in a place like Myanmar. So it often will leave people feeling a little unsatisfied, which I think is, again, why it's so important to celebrate those small wins and really have a collective vision of what you're working toward, not just hinging everything on legal justice, but also hinging it on social justice and deciding for yourself, deciding for your team, what does social justice look like in this context?
Great. Yeah. Thank you. The next question is, go back to the individual level and the community. What are the danger signs for someone to look out for with someone who looks at harmful online content? How can you tell when someone is reaching a limit, even if they won't acknowledge this themselves? And how do you ensure someone has an escape route if this is their job?
Mm.
A
That's
really
such
good
a good
question.
question. And I think that speaks to, it goes back to this idea that we're all in this together, that this is not an individual. It can't be just addressed on the individual level, and that we have to be aware of our teammates. One thing that I think is really important is, and it actually is important for investigations generally, is that working in pairs and really having a partner in an investigation is critical, because it's actually better for the open source work itself, because someone's seeing something that you're not seeing. Those are always the case, but it is also critical in exactly this instance where you can go, oh wait, I know, I can tell that something has changed in you. I can tell that you are reacting to this differently, or that you're more anxious or cranky, or you're sad, or you can't know, you have to know someone to know what's different in them, just like you have to know yourself to know what's changed in you. So that's one way, I think, is if you can do that, and I know that's hard in under-resourced organizations, but if you can at least have 2, maybe 3 people working on a project together, that can be a safety valve.
Yeah. And the next, sorry, Alexa, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the one other thing too is at the manager level or the organizational level, making sure you have a lot of opportunities for people to get the kinds of help they need. Just like everyone is affected differently based on their identity, what helps us each can be very, very different based on our identity. So whereas mindfulness exercises may particularly work for Andrea, for me, it might be something really different. Some people love individual therapy, and if you can provide that as an organization, great. Some people, that may be a particularly helpful way for them to process what they've experienced. So I think really thinking through all the range of ways you can provide openings for support, whether it's peer counseling, professional counseling, paid time off, etc. Really working as a team to come up with that menu can be really empowering.
Yeah,
And
thank
even
you.
go overboard. It's like, I think sometimes we think, okay, well, we offer this one therapy session once every, month or something, or we'll have one discussion every 6 months. I think it needs to almost be the opposite, where you're like, okay, all right, already, I know this stuff, but like, you make it so that people know that they can count on there being a place for them to talk about it, and to reflect and to process, and that there's some kind of built in and baked into the organization way, and as Alexa said, multiple ways to process the challenges of this work.
Great. Thanks so much. The next question is, sometimes I cannot control time to collect the video and photos for investigation. Do you have any rule for controlling the time to contribute? I would like to have some tips for it.
I'd say make a plan and give yourself a time period to do one investigative task. Maybe even set an alarm on your phone or something that will break you out of that rabbit hole that we all tend to fall into, so that you're just alerted. Pull yourself out, ask yourself, is this fruitful or is this not seeming fruitful? Do I need to re-strategize how to find the information I need? I think just for the sake of time, that would be my biggest tip or trick.
Mm-hmm.
I would also just add, sometimes even if you're all working virtually, or I mean, if you are in proximity to each other, that's a little bit easier. But even if can be in like a Zoom room or something together, then you can also time those things where you're like, all right, all of us are going to stop now and talk. All of us are going to, come out and have those built-in breaks. We found that was really important in looking at when we were looking at U.S. elections and and violence happening around that, is that we had that room to and said, okay, enforced break right now. So it was helpful.
Yeah. The other question that come in my inbox related to this is that after working with very graphic images, these images stuck in my head. Sometimes when I climbed the stair and I got a scary, and okay, sometimes I get a scary thoughts of the accidents that will happen to me. How could I handle such situation when that image stuck in my head?
There's a few different things. One, I would accept that that is very normal. And sometimes what you have to do is breathe or get a drink of water or somehow use one of your other senses can help break you out of ruminating on these ideas. I should say I'm not a psychologist. Andrea isn't either. So these are the kinds of things that we've been told from the neuroscientists and psychologists that were sources for our book. The other thing is that there's some really interesting research happening right now in neuroscience around creating a what's called a savoring channel, almost like a separate channel that you can learn to switch to when you get stuck on these channels of just really awful material. And they've done a lot of experimentation now with teenagers in particular, helping them when they're feeling good, like savor an idea. Like I think Andrea uses the example of a juicy peach in the book, but what, like imagining with all your senses, what that positive thing feels like, what it smells like, the sense of liquid in your mouth, etc., and build up almost like a few memories like this. And what they almost do is they tell teenagers to think of it like a YouTube channel, that you're switching to a different channel. So when you start to get stuck on one, you almost start practicing the ability to switch to something more positive, one that you've banked in the past and put up in your YouTube so that you can break out of that negative thought.
Great.
Just a tiny thing to add to that. One of the neuroscientists we talked with talked about this dysfunction trajectory, and that's what kind of that is. Like you get like almost like when you have a toothache and you just all you want to do is like stick your tongue and kind of keep poking at it, and it gets stuck in there. So yes, the techniques that Alexa was talking about, but I wanted to say that that's from what we understand, and again, this is from talking with those who are experts, that's perfectly normal. And I guess I just wanted to, one thing we didn't really say earlier is that a lot of the things that you're feeling and are normal reactions. These are things that will happen. And just because you're sad, this work is sad, it's difficult, you're going to feel sad. And that's a normal physical, emotional reaction. And so, as is replaying these things in your head. So I think it's important to know that it's when there's a change in worldview or a change in something really dramatic in how you are thinking about and approaching the world, where you need to really think and step back. Am I experiencing this secondary trauma in a way that's really not tenable to think about continuing? And again, we're not experts in that, but that's some of the warning signs is when things tip over to that more global sense of how you're approaching your life, that you need to be concerned.
Yeah. The next question is about horrible news that we see on the daily basis. A very good question from the attendees. They ask that many citizens choose to neglect the horrible news. Like, for example, it's the Nuevo Revolution. Is it the right way to reducing harm by just not looking at all this content, or what else would you suggest? And on the other hand, when people ignore this news, the number of people who participate in this revolution also decreasing.
Well, I think this is exactly one of the reasons why we wanted to write this book, because I think both of us, we agree that we don't want people to shrink from the news of the world and of the realities of our world, and to turn it off. Now there are some moments where and I think what we found is that you need to think about how do you selectively approach it to keep yourself safe so that you can stay engaged, so that if you're not somebody who's an activist or a lawyer or a journalist or someone engaging with the work daily, how do you take in the trauma of the world without just saying, I can't look at it? Because if people do that completely, then we're going to have fewer people who are trying to make change and engaging with the work for justice. And that's really problematic from my perspective. That's not to say, though, I mean, one thing we saw with the difference between, after the George Floyd murder happened and the video, the reaction to people watching that video to watching subsequent videos was very different. A lot of people made different choices about whether they wanted to watch that, and that was probably really healthy. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're not reading about what happened and looking and still engaging with the news of the day and of our world.
I would just add the one thought of going back to the idea of control, combating anxiety, and hope combating depression. If you can help people figure out how, I think one of the reasons people start to tune out is because they feel overwhelmed and like they can't actually do anything and they're just absorbing all this pain. So I do think sometimes if you can package the message with the positive stories of where change has been possible, or you give people really concrete suggestions for how they can have impact, sometimes that can help jumpstart again a desire and a willingness to engage. So often as journalists or reporters or human rights researchers, we tell people the worst stories over and over, thinking that will shock them into doing something when it can just overwhelm and numb. So I do think kind of switching that up with opportunities for positive impact, whether it's organizing a march or a letter campaign or whatever, can help to break through that experience.
And I
Great.
think the decimation of, sorry, one more point on this is the decimation of journalism in some regards, combined with the flood of open source information in our news feeds, means that sometimes we're getting traumatic content without this bigger analysis, without more context, without an understanding of the deeper issues at play. And so that is also problematic. I mean, I think if you watch any local news station in the United States, at least, it's just crime after crime after crime, and then there's not any bigger sense of the structural issues that gave rise to problems. And so like taking that in continually, that is problematic. And I think that there needs to be choices that people make of what kinds of news to engage with and on a deeper level.
Andrea and Alexa, I want to let you know that this is the seminar that have the highest number of questions since we run. So thanks to you both. I have one last question from the participants, and then I would like you to share one last thing that you'd like the participant to take away. Yeah, so I will ask one last question and then we will go to that. The question is, what do no harm principles are adhered to in terms of source protection? For example, a student in the lab assessing open source data from different stakeholders, citizen journalists witness and survival of atrocity crimes and NGO based inside Myanmar specifically. How are sources protected and how are investigators impacted when they are aware of the type of source?
I think one thing I would say is that we try and take the approach of holistic security. Organizations like Tactical Tech and others have really pushed this idea and helped to spread it, that you can't think about digital security, physical security, or psychological security in isolation from each other. When your psychological well-being starts to slip, the potential for someone to experience physical harm becomes greater. When we're concerned about whether our digital security is safe, we're going to feel more vulnerable. So really, I think always creating a plan for a team that is a holistic approach to who we need to protect, what we need to protect, and what our strategies are for mitigating those risks is really, really important. I think also on sources, like we try to, I mean, the mosaic effect is a very known phenomenon that I think unfortunately today you put out little bits of digital data. Someone who's an investigator or researcher can easily piece that with other bits of information, and even people you think you've protected, you potentially haven't. But again, it comes back to the awareness of not posting the geo coordinates of where someone has captured a video from just because you can show off that you know how to find that location. I think that was an early one that we had to grapple with, of, you know, really asking ourselves, even though these are just numbers on a page, they could potentially be giving away the, you know, the home location of a source, even if we don't know for sure that's their home. And so really, again, what Andrea said about working in pairs or working as a team is so important, because there may be ways that you think you protected everybody that someone else will catch. No, actually, we have a vulnerability here that we need to think through.
Thank you so much, Alexa, sharing that. So I would like you to share the final things, anything final takeaway that you would like to share with our audience today. I will start with you, Andrea.
I hope that you take away this sense that we are in this together, and that this work is difficult and so difficult, I know, and but it's worth it, and that you can find ways to do it in healthy ways for yourself, but also you can influence your organization to think about it in positive ways, and so that we can all continue to do the important human rights work that we have to do for the long haul. So I would say that, and I would also just thank you for the work that you do, because I know how important it is, and how difficult it is. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, thanks. That's so beautifully said. I don't have much to add other than this is, to be bringing together both the boots on the ground research and investigations with the digital data that we are all overwhelmed with, and trying to parse through and trying to figure out ways to use it for good. We're all kind of pioneers in a new era. Nobody has ever been bombarded with this much information of atrocity before. And I think it's like Andrea was suggesting, we are all in this together. We've all got to help each other figure out how to do this for the long haul. I hope we can all stay in conversation about the best ways to protect ourselves and protect each other, because we really do need to do that for the future of our own humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Alexa, for joining today and pioneering this work, which is really critical. And I would like to give a big thanks for our audience who joining us today. By showing up, it's already show that you care about this topic and you share about the communities. So I hope you take something from this workshop today and share it with your colleagues or your friends or your family. And last but not least, I share the upcoming book link from Andrea and Alexa on the chat. Please feel free to check it out. Do you know when you're gonna publish this?
We've heard end of June. My guess is it's going to be sometime later this summer, but sometime very soon.
That's great. Yeah. So if anybody would like to learn further, the link is there. And yeah, so thank you everyone for joining, and Andrea and Alexa. And for the audience, before you leave, if you can just share the feedback of this session with us, it would be really helpful on Zoom. I just share it for you to fill out. Yeah, thank you so much, and I hope to see you all again next time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea and Alexa.